So the Blair years, right? Things were good. We were in the middle of the boom economy, which part of that kind of the sine wave that is neoliberalism, right? They were having a boom economy at the time. Everyone was happy. Houses were continuing to go up in price. Child poverty was down. There was some level of investment in social programs that helped that, like Sure Start, etc. Obviously, it wasn't perfect, right? But in the middle of the boom, everyone seems to be happy because Blair had explicitly courted the middle class vote, right? He explicitly courted it by not engaging in house building, which is something that he really abandoned, and just pushing this, the neoliberal kind of third way position to try and keep middle class people on board in like a post kind of opinion shift after Thatcher and Major, right? Exactly, was continuing shutdown of industry in the north. That is true. That is true. Which again, like these were all created larger long-term problems. There were loads of policies that Labour implemented in the times they were in power under Blair and Brown, which we're seeing the ramifications of now, but created like short-term gains for Labour at the time. So things like private finance initiatives, things like continuing privatisation of the NHS, things like the lack of additional council house building. Thank you for the follow. Much appreciated. Follow through in. So they didn't build in 2004. 103 council houses were built in the entirety of the United Kingdom, right? Compared in 1970, we were building hundreds of thousands, literally 1,000 times more council houses a year than we were during the Blair years, right? Under a Labour government in the 70s. Why he just kind of, the reason why he didn't do that, because he knew he had to court the NIMBY vote to be able to continue winning these huge landslide elections like he had in 97 and 2000, right? So that has now led to the housing crisis that we have now by continuing to do that. The way in which he did the kind of tough on crime thing has never yielded any good results to actually reduce crime, and all has led is just kind of this adversarial relationship between different classes of people, especially in the London area, over the kind of the past 20 or so years since he was in power, and just never properly fixed any of the issues with neoliberalism that we had at the time. Like, so private finance initiatives are essentially using corporate money now to boost your books during your tenure that you can then wait for another government to pay off after you, which is essentially buying votes now to lose someone else's votes later, which is it's not good policy, both from from a moral standpoint and also from a practical standpoint, because you're gonna have to pay all of that private finance initiative money back eventually at the end of the day, which we're now seeing now with the huge amount of public sector debt that's been going on because of private finance initiatives. So we had these huge boom years during Blair where he bought votes by things like these initiatives. And these are all problems that we are now seeing the ramifications of now. Both Blair, Thatcher, Cameron, these are all people who continued these poor policies, right? And then the financial crash happened. And the financial crash happened, and this got blamed on the Blair administration and Brown as Chancellor at the time, right? When it's none of their fault. It was a global financial crash, and Brown's response to it, bringing RBS back under public control, engaging in some level of quantitative easing, and all that kind of jazz that he went on to try and save the economy in the wake of the post-financial crash was actually pretty good. There were better things that he could have done. He could have done in Iceland or whatever, but there are certainly worse ways that he could have dealt with that. And if anything, he probably saved huge sectors of the economy by engaging in the policies that he did post-financial crash. But somehow, the Tories and the media managed to spin the financial crash as being Labour's specific fault, which is incredibly frustrating because that was explicit Thatcher policy, all the deregulation during Thatcher, not during Blair and Brown, that led to the financial crash, right? This specific area of deregulation, specifically within the banking sector, will happen during Thatcher and Major, not during Blair and Brown. Yet somehow, this has been pinned as entirely the reason why New Labour fell in 2010. So all of the Liberals, all like the neoliberal Labour right people, they keep saying that, oh well, we only lost because of the financial crash, and they correctly identify that the right are pinning the financial crash on Labour when it's not really their fault. So all of the right of centre people in the Labour Party go, well, we have to continue Blairism because financial crash was the reason why they didn't get elected anymore. All of the Conservatives are saying it's just a financial crash, so that's Labour's fault. You can't trust them with the economy. So we never properly scrutinise the actual proper policy platform that was implemented by New Labour in the post-97 period. So you can't have any left movement saying, all of these policies were bad. We're seeing the ramifications now, because the Labour, right, and Liberals, they just don't want to fucking hear it. Whereas if we'd have just continued with the Labour government over time, that continued these poor policies that have led to the deprivation that we are seeing now, there would be a case to argue against it from a left-wing perspective. But the narrative has been shaped by the Conservatives and the Labour right. So there's this Boolean either neoliberalism or even worse neoliberalism, because we've never properly scrutinised the issues that we have now based upon the failure of policy from the Blair government, 97 to 2010. Which I would say that, again, as I said before, life was good for a lot of people under Blair, but there were long-term issues with the way in which they governed as a social liberal, as a third wayer, so to speak, right? That didn't really solve any issues and just created more problems. But it was happy to ride the electoral wave. And also, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, all the refugees, all of the people having to come here from Afghanistan, which is Blair's fault, right? To try and curry favor with the pro-war liberals within our shores, right? That doesn't it gets scrutinized as a way of killing British troops or whatever, but never gets scrutinized as a long-term issue of Middle Eastern, subcontinental, Asian destabilization that has led to the refugee crisis that we have now, and it never gets scrutinized properly. So there was a chat from an American there. Love following British politics. Does Labour look like it's getting shit together? They've been leading every major opinion poll since mid-December. There's something that looks like they might have staying power to whatever the next general election is. So, to clarify, Seabright 729, the party. I'm assuming you've been following Partygate and the cost of living crisis. This has been pinned on the current Conservative administration, right? So that Boris and Rishi Sunak they've been persona non grata with regards to the issues that have been going on with the cost of living crisis and with Partygate and the breaking of the rules and the COVID contract, etc., etc., etc. Right? So there's a Labour kind of bounce happening at the moment where people don't trust the Tories at all. Like in every single possible metric, people judge. When YouGov polling has shown that people trust Labour more with literally every single category that they poll them under, because the Conservatives are doing so bad. When you look at the actual polls for who they would vote for in a general election, the reason why Labour are ahead isn't because many Conservatives have moved over to Labour, only 15% or so. It's mostly because the Conservative vote have dropped off due to voter apathy, because they don't really have a party that represents their interests anymore, because they don't like Boris Johnson for being scummy, but they don't like Labour because Labour are the party of oiks or whatever, because they're all fucking Little England or rural people, right? So they just dropped out of the voting pool. They're not. So they're saying they won't vote. So what Labour have is incredibly tentative lead based upon issues with the Conservatives, because they're not pushing any policies. They've not got a vision. They've not got something that they're working towards. They're not offering real solutions. They're just saying the Tories are bad. Here's why they're bad. We're not the Tories. Please vote for us. Which isn't a long-term way of being able to generate proper support. And also, Starmer is clearly more focused on excising any left elements of the Labour Party rather than focusing on having anything that people might actually want to vote for. Yeah, exactly. Lex is right in that if there's continuous scandals, if he stays in power, if he doesn't get ousted by his own party, and he continues having scandals attributed to his name, then Labour probably will win the next election. Well, the issue there is that even from like a competitive perspective from the point of view of someone who wants there to be good leftist policy implemented in the UK, I think that because the Labour Party as at the moment does not represent any left leaning interests. It's become again a status quo party because young people don't vote. and the only reason they ever voted was for Jeremy Corbyn, right? But otherwise, they really don't vote, so they don't have their views represented by any kind of major party. Not just because they don't vote, for those incredibly small cohort as well. There's a reason why the baby boomers are called the boomers, is because there's loads of them, right? There was a baby boom, and that's what resulted, right? Obviously, I'm sure you know that, but just in case you weren't fully aware of where the names came from, whatever. So the biggest voting cohort in the UK is the boomers. So both parties will want to win whichever kind of nebulous middle class, middle income swing voter they feel they can sway. So the entire all policy is fought over these incredibly niche issues that only affect an incredibly small minority of the voter base. Because young people that do vote will always vote Labour. Old people that do vote will mostly vote will always vote Conservative because it's well within their material interests of which to do so. So there's just this incredibly tedious consensus politics war over an incredibly small minority of voters. So everyone else's interest gets completely left out. It's why Labour haven't properly committed to a proper pro-trans position, because these swing voter middle class liberal types are all fucking anti-trans, right? So there's no proper way of being able to get leftist policy involved in a party because they've decided in their focus groups that they've done that the only people that they really want to actually give votes to or to fight for the vote for are this mythical middle class swing voter, which means talking about policing. It means talking about means being the gratuitous flag waving and just random platitudes about prosperity and security, rather than talk about genuine change to the economic system, which is going to help people moving forward. Because I'm sure plenty of the people at the moment who are dealing with the issues of the financial downturn and the cost of living crisis and all of this stuff that's happening at the moment, a lot of these people probably aren't going to vote either. But they're not going to vote because Labour are offering them nothing. They just said, we will do a windfall tax if we were in power at this time. They didn't try and hold the Conservatives' feet to the fire when the Conservatives needed Labour votes to pass through COVID restrictions. By, I don't know, like, for example, the thing that was mostly being put through as an idea, but that Labour could use as a concession to get their votes in Parliament, was to implement like additional sick pay or full sick pay for people who were having to self isolate with coronavirus. But they just didn't fucking do it because they're trying to chase after this mythical swing voter. Well, the difference is that the demographic definitely does exist in the UK, right? There are for some reason there are undecided voters in this country. I don't know how there are undecided voters in this country, but there are. There are some people who just understand their own material interests and will vote based upon vibes, right? And these mostly just semi-comfortable, semi-middle class people, which are the swing vote. And they're usually between 40 to 60, because everyone above 60 and below 40, their voter base, their material conditions almost entirely move them towards some voting set, right? Obviously, it's more complicated than that. And there's a big generational divide based upon the ways in which people benefited from neoliberal policy shifts in the 80s. So, for example, I was talking before about in the 80s, the neoliberal Thatcher government sold off a load of council houses cheap to the boomer generation, which then the Gen Xers all inherited, and now they just become accidental landlords. I tweeted about it before. These were things that used to be in the public domain, then transferred to the private domain, but people can't afford them because rents are too high. The government's now paying housing benefit because the people can't afford the rent that otherwise the government would be collecting if they'd not sold off these council houses at incredibly cut price rates. It's just a bonkers system. Also, like in the building societies were demutualized and turned into financial institutions rather than mutual institutions. Um, so a load of boomers who had invested money into building societies for some kind of mutual benefit then got financial personal dividends from when they were demutualized under Thatcher. So all of these things were previously part of the social democratic consensus where most people kind of understood their overall benefit to society at large by being in mutual institutions or by being public institutions, all got sold off, and the beneficiaries of this were entirely one generation who've kept all that wealth that's now obviously not trickled down because trickle down doesn't work. So they've got all of the wealth and all of the assets, and young people have literally nothing apart from gig economy labor and zero pensions. Right, even pensions changed in the 80s that specifically benefited boomers over millennials. Now, the boomers got such good pensions, right? that we, as millennials or as Zoomers, are now getting like dramatically worse pensions to pay for the fact that the companies can't afford the incredibly generous pensions that they gave to boomers, which has been compounded by increases in the way in life expectancy because of how good the NHS is and how medical science has improved even over the last 40 years. Because the way pensions previously works, you got paid out a final salary pay based upon your defined, it's called a defined benefit pension, which is again got paid out every year as long as you stayed alive. And people living longer means that that dividend is much, much higher for defined benefit patients, right? For patients, sorry, defined benefit pensions. Whereas what we have now is millennials and Zoomers, when that all changed, as a defined contribution scheme where we contribute something from our paychecks, our employer contributes something from our paychecks, and at the end that becomes one big lump sum that we get then paid over time. What that means is if we live longer, that means that's one single lump sum is divided over a longer period, so we get less per year. So whereas the defined benefit people were supposed to be, if you lived a short amount of time, it paid you out, a good amount of money to be able to live on. But now they're living huge, way, way longer than they were before, and they're continuing to getting paid out incredibly, generous sums in these defined benefit pensions. Whereas we're gonna, hopefully live to, similar ages, but with incredibly small pots that we're going to have to make stretch out over time. There's going to be, when these defined contribution pension schemes become the norm amongst retirees, there's going to be a care crisis like we've never fucking seen. It's going to be fucking carnage, and I dread to think what's going to happen. Yeah, exactly. That's why, because they want to distract people away from the real economic issues because they know they've lost. They know they've lost. They know it doesn't work, right? So they have to distract people to be able to get, not only to distract people who would otherwise vote against their interests, get them distracted away from economic policy if like, you know, older boomers or whatever, or older working class boomers or whatever. But also because a bunch of people who were previously of an older generation who needed to vote to be able to protect their own, to be able to get more interest while being working class people, then moved up the class strata due to the sell off in the 80s. They're now middle class where they previously weren't. They would otherwise kind of drift away from politics. Once you've not got a cause, you tend not to get involved in politics as much. But if you get them hooked into the culture war juice, by God, they will vote. They'll come up and they'll vote Tory every time, right? You have to keep them engaged in the political scene, otherwise they just drift away and become non-voters. That's another reason why you see these continuous culture war talking points laundered through the media over and over and over and over and over again. And that's why I get so frustrated with the way in which New Labour engaged in their policy platform by not changing neoliberalism, in that this continuing generational chasm, where they had a good plan, right? I don't think from a personal standpoint, from an ethical standpoint, I don't think there should be tuition fees at university, for example, right? I don't think that should be a thing that should happen. But what the Blair government knew was by liberalising the institution of the university and making it a business rather than, a public service, it lowered the entry requirements for university intake, which massively spiked during the Blair years, right? Because if it's a financial institution where you want to make as much money as you can, why would you have a high barrier of entry for people wanting to study at university? You just want as many clients as possible, make as much money as possible. So loads of people went to university. Loads of millennials and Zoomers have gone to university. And what happens when they go to university? They become fucking Labour voters, right? He knew what he was doing. I don't think it's a good thing from a societal perspective, but it certainly created a legion of Labour voters, not just because of their own material conditions, but because of the attitudes that they gained from being in university, which I mean is an interesting dynamic there. But the Blair government could have fixed a load of things that has created this generational gap, which they just didn't do. And housing was one of the big ones, as well as, not fixing trade union laws, which has led, as I'm sure everyone in chat knows, if we're all leftists, we all know that there's just been this massive, gaping chasm between worker productivity and worker remuneration, which is mostly downwind. There's a really good Echo Gecko video of it on it, with regards to the lack of union representation, the lack of power of unions, which again could have been fixed by the Blair government, but wasn't. And these trends have continued, and all it's led to is the disasters that we have now, because it started by Thatcher, mostly continued by Blair, and obviously continued, made even worse by the austerity of Cameron and Osborne. They had the power to fix things, and all they've done is create more problems by not fixing those problems and exacerbating ones that already existed. Jesus Christ. Oh god. To be honest, I've had COVID and it wasn't that bad for me, but I've seen some people have horrendous reactions to COVID, so I really hope that they get better. Why are you worried by Talk TV and backed by Murdoch or by the actualization of GB News? Yeah, I'm worried about it too. Although I think people kicked up too much for shit fit about Grace Blakely being involved. I'm like, who cares? Like, she wants to get some more money by going on a talk show. Maybe someone will hear some Marxism at some point, or whatever. She's not. She's not like people say. Oh, she's lending credence to the far right. I'm just like, well, was there any is there any more credence whether she goes on or not? I don't really think so. So I don't really fucking care. But I think you're right in that this continuous um, press engagement with the culture war is going to be a real problem moving forwards. Although eventually the boomers will die off, and we'll just have a generation of millennials and zoomers who have gained nothing. They have no asset wealth. They have nothing at all. All of the asset wealth of the boomers and the Gen X and the Gen Xers has all been sucked up by private equity firms, right? As neoliberalism, fucking like neoliberalism go burr over time, right? That's going to get sucked up by private finance institutions, and we're going to have two generations left with nothing, and there's just going to be like a huge surge of left wing populism at that time. That's what I predict at the very least. But obviously, we're still to wait 20 years or so, 15, 20 years for all the boomers to shuffle off their mortal claws at the end of the day. Partly still struggling with breathing. Oh, neuropathy. Fuck. I do hope they get better. Oh, sorry, he gets better. Sorry. Um, Fingers crossed for you. Um, and yeah, it's frustrating because we now have a Labour Party who continues what the same kind of talking points that Brown and Blair were doing during that particular premiership, not looking to fix any of the problems by making any systemic change, by not committing to nationalisation, which was one of Keir Starmer's fucking pledges, right, which would fix a lot of these issues. We now have Wes Streeting going on TV praising Thatcher, praising David Cameron, praising Theresa May or whatever. We have Wes Streeting talking about, oh, I got spanked as a child. It was fine. It's not a problem. The fucking like alabaster leech that he is, right? All just completely giving so much credence to these conservative narratives, these right wing narratives, neoliberal narratives, not doing any pushback. And there's going to be no way of being able to move things left after that. It's incredibly frustrating. And these are huge issues that are never going to get fixed because the way voter demographics are materially work at the moment is you can't, put forward these narratives because people don't want to hear it because of the way the material conditions are set up. So it's very, very difficult. Yeah, Wes Streeting is like public enemy number one as far as I'm concerned. He's worse than like Keith. I hate him so much. He's also transphobe, obviously, so I hate that guy. He's so bad. But yeah, so to sum up, Blair and Brown bad, but not for the reasons that everybody thinks. And if you're watching future YouTube viewers, please like, comment, and subscribe, and click the bell to see when I go live. And I hopefully will see you on a stream at some point, future YouTube viewers. I hope you take care.